Okay, it's been pretty busy the last couple of weeks, and now we're into the home stretch. We're going to be looking at what would normally be interactive music using Ableton Live to lay out things on a timeline, pre-sequence stuff, and then play with a live input. But obviously, due to the pandemic, we can't do that. So this will be a prelude to interactivity instead. We're going to start with the voice and aspects of automation and how we can use those to mangle the voice, create new and interesting textures out of it, and just generally have some fun with it. So again, we can't do truly interactive pieces in class since we're doing everything online, but this will be preparation for you that you can follow up on in 3702 and especially in interactive computer music, MUS 4711, which is all interactive all the time. For now, the main things that you need to consider are a couple of things. Pre-planning. What do you want to happen in your piece? When do you want that to happen? I cannot stress enough how important pre-planning is. Draw everything out on some graph paper, create a timeline, and use that to sequence events on paper before you first start working in the DAW. It is a massive lifesaver. Next, what is the sound source that you're going to be using for the interactive, or in this case, recorded part? Is it going to be a piece for voice and computer, instrument and computer, synth and computer? What? And how do you record it? What mics do you need? What do you need in terms of other equipment and location and etc.? Next, how are you going to sequence and automate the necessary parameters in your DAW to transform and manipulate the quote-unquote live part in this case? So we're going to spend the remaining weeks of class devoted entirely to this topic to get you ready to write your own pieces that could be interactive using Ableton Live or later in Max MSP. Since we're going to start with voices, there's a couple of considerations. One thing is, why are we doing voices? And the answer is, everybody has one. And they sound pretty cool when you run them through a bunch of effects. But for recording considerations, you need to think about the type of mic that you're going to use. Dynamic or condenser. Dynamic is going to have great rejection of ambient sounds. You have to get much closer to a dynamic mic in order to record, which is massively, massively beneficial when you don't want bleed from other sources. They do tend to lose some of the upper frequencies though, but for speaking voices, that's usually fine. For a condenser, I strongly recommend that you only use a large diaphragm. They tend to color the sound, yes. They tend to be a little bit warmer, yes. However, small diaphragm mics tend to be a little colder sounding than large diaphragms. That said, a small diaphragm condenser pair can work very well if you want to do stereo effects by physically moving around the recording space. But again, they tend to sound a little colder than a large diaphragm. What about the polar pattern you're using? Well, for voice, cardioid or supercardioid are best for having off-axis rejection, but you will need to make sure that you stay on axis when you're recording. So don't tilt your head in the opposite direction of the mic or move to the side of the mic or anything like that. Omni mics are an interesting choice for voices, mostly because they're not subject to the proximity effect boost that you'll have in the bass frequencies from bringing the mic physically closer to your source. But that's not usually a vocal issue. Although if your vocalist is a low register bass, it's something to consider. However, a couple of considerations. No matter what type of mic you plan on using, for the love of all that is holy, use a pop filter. If you don't have one, go on Amazon and buy one. They're cheap. If you can't afford one, you can get a wire coat hanger, bend it, and put some pantyhose on it, or put an N95 mask, or just like any cloth, like a bandana, and put that in front of the mic so you don't have plosive consonants. please. Another big consideration is to make sure you have a stable mic stand that can support the weight of your mic. Just the access or on-stage stands might not be able to handle larger mics. You know, your classic SM58 is 2/3 of a pound, but a blue bottle weighs 3.75 pounds. You need a serious stand to hold that thing up. Next, properly set your input gain to avoid ambient noises and clipping. Listen to it as you're bringing the gain up. Make sure you do a couple of test recordings to see if you hear any ambient hum, anything like that. Record as cleanly as possible. Don't be afraid of doing multiple takes. This is the magic of the studio. You can use as many takes as you want. With automation, we've talked about this already, but again, anything you can click, turn, push, move, etc. in a DAW can be automated. Again, you are responsible for knowing how to operate your chosen DAW's automation parameters. They're all slightly different, but again, pretty much anything in a DAW can be automated. You also can record and overdub automation data. I love this. I will map something out to a MIDI controller and use the faders and knobs on that so I can play it. I'll go into overwrite mode, latch mode, then I'll just cycle through the piece and I'll move the faders up and down to go and add all the breakpoints. Yes, there will be thousands of them if you do it that way, but who cares if it sounds good? You can also use the pencil tool and the automation lanes to add breakpoints to sequence it a little bit more directly. And keep in mind, a lot of those DAWs have the ability to change the curve between breakpoints to go from linear to logarithmic to exponential. And then some DAWs have built-in curves that can be inserted. You select a region in the automation lane, you can insert a sine wave that takes that amount of time. It's a very cool thing. Any of these approaches are valid as long as you assign them to a valid target. Doesn't matter. Could be filter cutoff, resonance, could be track volume, track panning, whatever. As long as it's a valid target, you can use those techniques. But we'll look at how to do this in class.